Hello everyone, welcome to One Story channel. In the last episode, we shared the story of Brayden's encounter with Jesus and his journey to seek redemption and healing for his autistic daughter. It was a difficult parenting journey and a baptism of faith. In fact, Brayden's connection with Jesus began earlier in childhood. This little boy's life seemed ordinary, but because of his relationship with God and his faith, it became full of miracles and grace. This story is not only about a person's tenacity in the face of life's hardships, but also about how a person discovers himself under God's guidance and achieves the impossible. A different beginning. Brayden was different from other children from a young age. He was born into a normal family. His parents were devout Christians who took their children to church every week. However, Brayden was not as carefree as his brothers and sisters. He had severe learning disabilities and could barely read, write, or do math like other children. At school, Brayden was placed in a special education class. While his classmates attended regular lessons, he needed extra help just to keep up. Despite this assistance, he still felt helpless. The other kids would often mock him for his slow learning speed, teasing him in class. Every day after school, Brayden would return home with a heavy heart, lock himself in his room, and cry in frustration. Yet, even in those lonely moments, Brayden felt an unusual presence with him. It was as if an invisible hand was gently guiding him through the hardships he thought he couldn't endure. Although he didn't fully understand this force, he gradually realized that it might be God, caring for him in mysterious ways. Brayden's family never gave up on him. Even though the school principal had once suggested he drop out and learn a trade, relying on manual labor for his future, Brayden's mother firmly believed that he had a greater purpose. She refused to accept the principal's suggestion and prayed for Brayden even more frequently. Every night, when Brayden cried, his mother would sit by his bedside, gently hug him and say, "Child, God loves you. He has a special plan for you." A prophetic calling. Although his mother's comfort gave Brayden warmth during those lonely nights, the reality of his school days remained harsh. The ridicule and bullying from classmates, combined with the constant struggle to complete his assignments, left him feeling more and more discouraged. Eventually, in one high school semester, Brayden decided to drop out. He stopped trying to meet the academic demands that seemed impossible for him and began working at a local grocery store instead. Every day, Brayden packed groceries, performing mechanical, repetitive tasks. He thought his life would continue like this, simple and uneventful. But then, God began to communicate with him in mysterious ways. Brayden's parents were attending Bible school at the time, and their home was often visited by spiritual leaders and preachers. Among these visitors, some would look at Brayden and deliver prophetic words. "This child has a calling from God. He is destined to do great things." These prophecies confused Brayden. He had heard that God had special plans for certain people, but why would these preachers think that he, someone who struggled to complete basic tasks, someone at the bottom of society, could be chosen by God for something great? Brayden decided to pursue a GED, hoping to prove that he was more than the child with learning disabilities. However, the result left him even more discouraged. He failed the exam. Disheartened, he abandoned his pursuit of formal education and devoted himself entirely to his work, day after day repeating simple physical labor. Despite this, Brayden still harbored a deep sense of hope for the future. He believed that God had not abandoned him. Although he didn't yet understand what his calling was, he began to pray more frequently, seeking God's guidance. Building a relationship with God. As time went on, Brayden gradually realized that his relationship with God had become unique. No longer feeling lost as he had in his childhood, he started to build a deeper connection with God through prayer and reading the Bible. Whenever he felt confused, he would sit quietly and pray, asking God for help. Each time he poured out his worries in prayer, he would feel a calming strength that eased his heart. Though Brayden's life was still full of challenges, God's voice seemed clearer than ever. He started listening to teachings, especially sermons by Kenneth Hagin. These teachings began to reshape his views on life and faith. Brayden immersed himself in these lessons, working by day and listening to sermons by night. He drew infinite strength from them. God also led Brayden to fasting. He was instructed to fast every other day, from sunrise to sunset, and he followed this direction faithfully. As a young man, he dedicated each day to prayer, fasting, and studying the Bible, longing to establish a deeper connection with God. During this period, Brayden's prayer life became more profound. He didn't just pour out his heart to God, he also learned to listen to God's voice. He began to realize that God spoke to him in many ways, sometimes through a verse in the Bible, sometimes through an intuition, and sometimes through the events of daily life. Brayden sensed that he was undergoing a kind of spiritual growth and that God was gradually guiding him toward a greater mission. The first step into ministry. When Brayden turned 18, an unexpected opportunity arose. Some friends invited him to join their ministry work. This invitation was a great surprise to Brayden, who had always longed to serve God in a greater capacity. However, Brayden didn't immediately begin preaching. In fact, his work was quite simple: cleaning houses, washing cars, and maintaining the home of a pastor. He felt a bit disappointed, but he didn't give up. He understood that this might be God's way of testing his obedience. While performing these mundane tasks, Brayden continued to pray and learn. He knew he wasn't fully prepared to take on greater responsibilities yet, but he trusted that as long as he remained obedient, God would eventually open another door for him. A few years later, Brayden got married, and he and his wife moved to a new place to help his parents run a boys' ranch. Their mission was to care for young boys who had no fathers. Though the work was challenging, Brayden felt that he was gradually moving closer to the mission God had prepared for him. Brayden's involvement in church ministry also progressed slowly. He began to engage in more ministry work, but he soon discovered that he still wasn't given the opportunity to preach. The church's pastor believed that Brayden's preaching style was too charismatic for their congregation, so Brayden was asked to continue his janitorial work, cleaning the church's bathrooms and floors. Obedience and patience. Brayden's heart was filled with confusion and struggle. He knew he was called by God to preach, so why was he stuck doing simple cleaning work? He started to complain to God, his heart weighed down with discontent. One day, while scrubbing the church bathrooms, Brayden's frustrations boiled over. "God, I've done so much for you, why won't you let me preach?" he cried out. But God's response shocked him. "Brayden, you are doing what I asked, but not with a willing heart. Until you can do this work with complete joy for me, I will not release you." Brayden realized that while he had been obedient to God's commands, he had resisted in his heart. He took a deep breath and decided to change his attitude. From that moment, he approached each day's work with joy, no longer complaining, but serving God wholeheartedly. Every time he entered the church and picked up his cleaning tools, he reminded himself, "I am doing this for the Lord, not for man." God's test. With renewed determination, Brayden faced his repetitive tasks with a different mindset. No longer seeing cleaning bathrooms and scrubbing floors as burdens, he viewed them as tests of his faith and obedience. He began to pray over every object he cleaned, seeking God's purpose in every small task. Brayden realized that God didn't just want him to finish his work, he wanted Brayden to grow spiritually through it. As time went on, Brayden's prayer life deepened. While cleaning the bathrooms, he would pray silently, sometimes in tongues, pouring out his heart to God. He felt that his spirituality was growing during this period, and he began to understand that obedience wasn't just about outward actions, it required inner humility and willingness. Yet despite his growing spirituality, Brayden occasionally felt confused and exhausted. After all, 10 years had passed, and he was still working as a janitor, not a preacher. Sometimes he would ask himself, "God, when will I fulfill my calling? When will I finally preach?" Whenever these thoughts surfaced, he would remind himself to keep faith and patience. The difficult choice. Finally, after 10 years of obedience and patience, Brayden received clear guidance from God. One morning in 2013, God's voice echoed clearly in his heart, "Brayden, it is time. You may leave now." These words filled Brayden with both excitement and anxiety. He had grown accustomed to his life over the past decade. Despite occasional feelings of weariness and doubt, cleaning the church had become a part of him. "God, are you sure?" he asked in prayer. "I no longer resent this work. I've even started to enjoy it." God replied, "I know you no longer resist, that's why I am releasing you now." Everything has been preparing you for what's next." Hearing this, Brayden took a deep breath. He understood that the obedience, patience, and faith he had learned over the past 10 years were finally bearing fruit. He resigned from his job as a janitor, unsure of where God would lead him next, but confident that he was ready for his new mission. The business path. After leaving his cleaning job at the church, Brayden assumed he would immediately enter full-time ministry. However, to his surprise, God led him into the business world instead. This decision confused Brayden. After all, he had known from a young age that he had a calling to preach. Why was God now directing him to business? Despite his confusion, Brayden chose to obey. In the business world, he relied on God's guidance just as he had in ministry. He began to start small businesses, and though the beginning was tough, he believed that as long as he continued to seek God's direction, everything would turn out fine. His faith proved correct. God continuously gave him ideas and inspiration, and his businesses gradually began to thrive. Brayden realized that even though he wasn't yet preaching, God was still at work in his life, blessing him and his family through business. Brayden and his wife worked together during this time. His wife was very smart, having been an excellent student in school. To help improve their financial situation, she decided to go back to school to pursue a master's degree in accounting. Brayden supported her every step of the way, and together they worked hard to help her complete her studies. Even during this period, their life was filled with challenges. They lived in a modest rental house, barely making ends meet, sometimes relying on food stamps to survive. Despite the difficulties, Brayden never stopped praying. He prayed for his family, for their business, and for God's next step. His wife eventually earned her master's degree with top marks, but due to various circumstances, she did not secure the expected job. Brayden understood that this was also part of God's plan, and that they needed to remain faithful even when things didn't go as expected. An unexpected calling. 7 years passed, and Brayden focused on his business, achieving financial stability. Although he had let go of his initial dream of ministry, he continued to maintain a close relationship with God. He thought his life path was now set, until God gave him a completely new calling. One quiet morning, Brayden was praying when he clearly heard God's voice. "Brayden, I want you to do something new. I want you to start a YouTube channel." This directive surprised and unsettled Brayden. He wasn't familiar with the YouTube world, nor had he ever considered becoming a content creator. However, knowing that God's guidance had never led him astray, he chose to obey once more. Brayden began recording videos, sharing his experiences with God, his testimonies of faith, and the power of prayer. At first, his subscriber count was minimal, and few people paid attention to his content. But Brayden didn't lose heart. He kept recording, pouring his sincerity and faith into every video. A few months later, his channel experienced a sudden surge in growth. Thousands of viewers began subscribing, eager to hear his story. Brayden realized that this was all God's doing. He was simply following God's lead. The final mission. Today, Brayden stands at the beginning of a new journey. His YouTube channel now has tens of thousands of subscribers, and his life has been transformed by God's grace. Though this journey has been filled with challenges and hardships, Brayden never wavered in his trust and obedience to God. He understands now that every step he took was preparation for the mission he is currently fulfilling. 10 years of cleaning church bathrooms, 7 years of business efforts. All these seemingly ordinary experiences paved the way for his greater calling. Brayden now knows that his life has never been a random journey, but rather a plan meticulously woven by God. Through his story, he shares an important truth with the world. God uses imperfect people to accomplish great works. No matter how ordinary you may feel, or how overlooked you may seem, as long as you obey God's guidance, He will use you to achieve extraordinary things. Brayden's story is far from over. He continues to pray every day, seeking God's will, and preparing for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. He believes that as long as he maintains his faith and obedience, every twist and turn in life will be part of God's marvelous plan. And he will continue to walk this path of faith with unwavering determination.